Rain fell hard on the broken metal ship that had been sitting in the mud for 3 years. Daniel Reyes sat under a torn piece of the hull, fixing a water pump with hands that had grown rough from years of farm work he never asked to learn. He was not a soldier. He was not a scientist. He used to fix machines back on Earth, and now he fixed whatever kept him alive on this strange green world. The planet did not have a name that humans had given it yet. The dragons who lived here called it something long and musical that Daniel could never fully pronounce. He had learned enough of their language to trade, to warn them when storms were coming using his old weather sensors, and to earn a strange kind of respect from creatures 20 times his size. That respect was the only reason 3 dragon elders were now standing outside his shelter in the rain, their wings pulled close to their bodies, their eyes dim with grief. The tallest one, a silver-blue elder named Rask, spoke first. "Our nests are dying, Skywalker. The eggs do not hatch. Something eats the life from them before they can open their eyes." Daniel wiped his hands on his jacket and stepped out into the rain. "How many eggs are left?" "One clutch. 5 eggs. All dying but slower than the rest." Rask lowered his massive head. "We ask you because your kind builds strange things. Things that fix broken bodies." Daniel had built a small medical scanner from parts of his crashed ship, mostly to check his own health since he had no doctor here anymore. "I'm not promising anything," he said, "but bring them here." They brought the eggs that night, wrapped in warm moss and leaves. Daniel laid them under a heat lamp powered by his last working battery and began to scan each one, watching strange readings flicker across his cracked screen. 4 of the eggs showed almost no life signal at all. The 5th one, smaller than the rest and slightly misshapen, showed a weak but steady heartbeat. He worked through the night without sleep, adjusting the temperature, filtering the water they were kept near, even mixing minerals from his old supply kit into the soil beneath them based on guesses more than knowledge. By morning, 4 eggs had gone completely still. Only the small one remained, pulsing faintly like a tiny drum. 3 days later, that egg cracked open. The elders returned to see the hatchling, and their faces sank into something between pity and disappointment. She was small, smaller than any hatchling they had ever seen. Her scales were a pale gold color, almost see-through in the sunlight. But it was her wings that made the elders shake their heads. They were thin, uneven, and folded wrong against her back, like crumpled paper instead of proper dragon wings. "She will never fly," said Rask quietly. "It is our way to release the weak ones back to the earth, so they do not suffer a long, painful life." "No," Daniel said. The elders looked at him in surprise. Among the dragons, no one argued with the old ways, not even the youngest of them. "She's not going anywhere," he continued. "You said humans build strange things. Fine, I'll build her strange wings if I have to. But nobody is putting her back in the ground." Rask studied him for a long moment, his ancient eyes unreadable. "Skywalker, sentiment will not make her fly. Her body is broken. No tool can fix what nature has failed to give." "Maybe," Daniel said, picking up the small hatchling gently in both hands. She was warm and impossibly light, barely heavier than a bird. "Or maybe nature just didn't finish the job, and I will." The elders left without further argument, though their silence carried its own kind of judgment. Dragons believed in fate and bloodline and the will of the sky. Daniel Reyes believed in wrenches, second chances, and stubbornness. That night, sitting beside a small fire with the hatchling wrapped in a blanket meant for himself, Daniel tried out names in his head. He thought of his wife, gone years now, back on a planet he would probably never see again. She used to say that even the darkest nights held a little bit of light if you knew where to look. "Lumi," he said out loud, testing the sound. The hatchling opened one eye at the sound of his voice and let out a small, sleepy chirp, as if she approved. "Lumi it is," Daniel whispered, holding her a little closer against the cold. "Welcome to the world, kid. It's not going to be easy, but I promise you, we're going to figure this out together." Outside, the rain continued to fall over a planet where dragons had ruled the skies for 1,000 generations, and a small, broken hatchling had just been given something no elder or ancient magic could offer her, a father who refused to accept impossible. 3 years passed, and the small homestead by the crashed ship had grown into something like a real home. Daniel had built a fence from scrap metal, a garden from seeds he had been saving since the crash, and a wooden perch outside his shelter where a young dragon liked to sit and watch the other hatchlings of her age group learn to fly. Lumi was no longer a tiny hatchling. She stood about as tall as Daniel now, with pale gold scales that shimmered faintly under sunlight, and eyes that had grown sharper and more curious with every passing season. But her wings had not grown the way dragon wings were supposed to grow. They were thin, uneven, one slightly shorter than the other, folded against her back like something unfinished. Every morning, the young dragons of the nearby clan gathered on the cliffs above the valley to practice flying, leaping off the edge and catching the wind beneath wide, powerful wings. Lumi would watch from her perch, her tail curled tightly around her legs, saying nothing. "You don't have to watch them," Daniel said one morning, setting a bowl of food beside her. "I like watching," Lumi said, her voice a soft rasp that dragons her age usually didn't have yet, a side effect of scales that had grown a little slower than normal. "Maybe if I watch enough, I will understand what I am doing wrong." Daniel sat down beside her, ignoring the ache in his knees from years of hard living. "You're not doing anything wrong, kid. Your wings are just built differently." "Built wrong," Lumi corrected quietly. "Different," Daniel said firmly. "Different isn't wrong. It just means the normal way of doing things won't work for you. So we find a new way." This was not the first time they had this conversation, and Daniel suspected it would not be the last. The other dragons her age had already stopped inviting her to fly with them, not out of cruelty exactly, but because watching her try and fail again and again had become something the whole clan found uncomfortable. The elders, especially Rask, still believed she had been kept alive against the natural order, and some of the younger dragons had picked up on that belief without fully understanding why. That afternoon, Daniel pulled out an old notebook, one of the few paper items he had saved from the ship, and began sketching diagrams of wing structures. He was no biologist, but he understood machines, weight distribution, balance, and the basic physics of how things move through air. He measured Lumi's wingspan, checked the thickness of her wing bones using the old scanner, and compared the numbers to what he remembered about how the older dragon's wings were shaped. "Your wings are shorter, but they're not weak," he said, tapping his pencil against the notebook. "The muscle here, along your back, that's actually strong. Stronger than it should be for wings this size." "Then why can't I fly?" Lumi asked, frustration slipping into her voice. "Because your wings can't create enough lift on their own yet. But strength plus the right support might be able to fix that." Lumi tilted her head, unsure what he meant, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Over the following weeks, Daniel spent every spare hour scavenging pieces from the wrecked ship, thin sheets of lightweight metal, old wiring, anything that could be reshaped into something useful. He wasn't building her fake wings. He was building supports, thin frames that could attach along the edges of her real wings to give them the shape and stiffness they were missing. The first attempt failed within seconds. The frame was too heavy, pulling Lumi sideways the moment she tried to flap. She landed hard in the dirt, more embarrassed than hurt, refusing to look at him for the rest of the day. "That's one," Daniel said gently that evening, sitting beside her as she sulked near the fire. "Back on Earth, we had a saying. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. "I don't understand," Lumi muttered. "It means failing isn't the end of anything. It's just part of getting somewhere better. The people who built the first flying machines on Earth crashed a lot before they got it right. A lot more than 7 times, honestly." "Humans could not fly either?" Lumi asked, surprised. Daniel laughed softly. "Nope. No wings at all. We had to build our way into the sky using nothing but stubbornness and metal." "Sound familiar?" For the first time in days, Lumi let out a small huff that might have been a laugh. "So you were saying I am like a human?" "I'm saying you've got the same kind of fight in you," Daniel said, ruffling the scales on top of her head the way he used to ruffle a dog's fur back on Earth. "And that fight is worth more than perfect wings." That night, as Lumi drifted off to sleep near the dying fire, Daniel stayed awake a little longer, sketching new designs by lantern light. The frame needed to be lighter. The balance needed to be better. He didn't know if it would work, not really, but for the first time since the crash, he felt something close to purpose burning steady in his chest. Somewhere above them, the other young dragons of the clan slept soundly in their nests, their flying lessons complete for another day. Down below, a small, uneven dragon slept beside a fire, wrapped in the quiet certainty that someone believed she was worth the effort. It was, Daniel thought, a start. The fourth wing frame was lighter than a leaf, or so Daniel liked to joke, though in truth it weighed about as much as a small bird. He had spent 2 weeks shaving down the metal, testing different shapes, and studying old pictures in his notebook of airplane wings he remembered from books he read as a kid. This one, he was almost certain, would work. "Hold still," he said, carefully strapping the thin frame along the edge of Lumi's left wing, then the right. The straps were made from old parachute cord, soft enough not to hurt her scales, but strong enough to hold the shape steady. Lumi shifted nervously on the cliff's edge, a spot Daniel had chosen because it had a gentle slope instead of a sharp drop, in case things went wrong again. Below them, the valley stretched out in green and gold, the crashed ship a small gray speck in the distance. "What if it doesn't work again?" she asked. "Then we learn something, and we try a fifth one," Daniel said simply. "That's how this works, kid. There's no version of this where we just give up because something is hard." Nearby, a small group of young dragons had gathered to watch, some out of curiosity, others clearly expecting to see her fail again. Among them was a dragon named Tavok, one of the largest and strongest flyers his age, who had once been friendly with Lumi before her wings became something the others whispered about. "You're wasting your time," Tavok called out, though there was no real cruelty in his voice, just simple dragon logic. "Wings are wings. No human trick changes what nature gave you." Daniel didn't answer him. Instead, he crouched down to Lumi's eye level. "Forget them. Forget the wind. Forget the wings. Forget everything except this. When I count to 3, you run, and you believe with everything you've got that you're going to fly. Not because your wings are perfect, because you decided you're not stopping until they are." Lumi took a shaky breath. "One way to fly is to jump like the others." "That's their way," Daniel said. "We're doing it our way. Ready?" She nodded, her golden eyes steady despite the fear behind them. 1, 2, 3. Lumi ran, her claws digging into the dirt, wings snapping open with the new frames giving them a shape they had never held before. She reached the edge of the slope and pushed off with everything her legs could give her. For one terrifying second, she dropped. Then the wind caught the new frame, and instead of tumbling, she leveled out, wobbling wildly but staying airborne, gliding low over the grass below the cliff instead of crashing into it. The watching dragons went silent. Even Tavok's mouth hung slightly open. Lumi didn't fly far, maybe the length of 10 dragon bodies before she landed hard in a roll, kicking up dust and grass. But she had been in the air, really in the air, wings holding her weight against gravity for the first time in her life. She scrambled to her feet, breathing hard, staring back at the cliff where Daniel was already running down the slope toward her. "I flew," she said, disbelief thick in her voice. "I actually flew." "You glided," Daniel said, laughing as he reached her, checking quickly that she wasn't hurt. "But that's step 1. Flying is step 2, and we're getting there." Word of what happened spread through the clan faster than Daniel expected. By the next morning, even Rast the Elder came to see for himself, watching silently from a distance as Daniel adjusted the frame once more and Lumi practiced short glides across the valley floor, each one a little longer, a little steadier than the last. "This is not natural," Rask said when Daniel finally approached him. "No," Daniel agreed. "It's not. But it's real, and that matters more." Rask studied Lumi for a long moment as she circled back toward them, landing with only a small stumble this time instead of a hard fall. "Our stories say dragons fly because the sky calls to their soul, not because of metal strapped to their backs." "Maybe the sky is still calling her," Daniel said. "Maybe she just needed a little help answering." Rask said nothing to that, but something in his old eyes shifted, just slightly, from doubt into something closer to consideration. Over the following weeks, Lumi's glides became longer, steadier, more controlled. She learned to catch rising air currents the way Daniel had read about eagles doing back on Earth, using them to lift higher without tiring her wings too quickly. She was not fast like the other dragons, and she still could not climb as high, but she was flying, in her own uneven, determined way. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Daniel watched her circle once above the homestead before landing gently beside him, her scales catching the orange light like polished gold. "They said I would never fly," she said quietly, folding her wings. People, and apparently dragons, say a lot of things, Daniel said, smiling. Doesn't make them true. Lumi leaned her head against his shoulder, a small gesture of trust that had grown between them over years of failure and patience. Thank you for not believing them. Daniel wrapped an arm around her neck, feeling the steady thrum of her heartbeat, faster now from the flight, but strong, alive, undeniable. Always, kid, he said. Always. Neither of them knew yet that somewhere beneath the very ground they stood on, something old and dangerous was beginning to stir, something that would soon test everything Lumi had learned about flying, and everything Daniel had taught her about never giving up. The first sign of trouble was a smell, faint and sour, drifting from the direction of the old nesting grounds near the eastern ridge. Daniel noticed it while checking his water traps one morning, a smell that reminded him faintly of burnt wiring, though there was no reason for anything electrical to be out here. By the time he reached the nesting grounds, a crowd of dragons had already gathered, and the sound reaching him was worse than the smell. It was the low, pained moaning of adult dragons, strong ones, curled on the ground with their scales turning a sickly gray around the edges. It's the blight, Lumi said beside him, landing hard and folding her wings quickly. Her flying had improved greatly over the past year, strong enough now that she rarely needed Daniel to walk beside her anywhere. The same sickness that killed the other eggs when I hatched. Daniel's stomach tightened. He remembered those 4 still eggs, the ones that never had a chance. It's not supposed to affect adults. It never has before, Rask said, approaching them with visible exhaustion in his old eyes. 2 of the sick dragons were his own hunting partners, dragons he had flown beside for over 100 years. Our healers have tried everything. Old magic, herbs, songs passed down since before memory. Nothing slows it. Daniel knelt beside one of the weakened dragons, a large male whose breathing had become shallow and uneven. Using the same scanner he had used on the eggs years ago, now much improved with parts he had scavenged since, he ran a slow reading across the dragon's chest. The results didn't make sense at first. There was no infection, no poison, nothing that matched any illness pattern the scanner recognized. Instead, there was a strange radiation signature, faint but steady, the kind of reading Daniel associated with old power cells or damaged reactors, not sickness. This isn't natural, he muttered. What do you mean? Lumi asked, crouching beside him. I mean, this isn't a disease. It's exposure. Something is leaking energy into the ground here, and it's poisoning everything nearby slowly. Daniel stood, looking toward the ridge where the smell seemed strongest. Rask, how long have dragons nested in this exact spot? Since before written memory, Rask said. It is sacred ground. Has anything strange ever happened here? Lights in the ground, strange sounds, anything at all? Rask hesitated, then answered slowly. There are old stories. A star fell from the sky long before the first dragon hatched here. The elders say it sleeps beneath the ridge, and that it is why the ground here is warm even in winter. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A fallen star, warmth in the ground, radiation readings that matched old, damaged power sources. It didn't take a scientist to connect those pieces, only someone who understood that stars weren't always stars, and that ancient wreckage could sleep quietly for centuries before something disturbed it. I need to check something, he said. Lumi, can you fly me along the ridge? I want to see the ground from above. They rose together into the afternoon sky, Lumi carrying Daniel carefully in a harness he had built specifically for moments like this, moments where his human legs simply couldn't move fast enough. From above, the ridge looked ordinary at first, rocky and bare, but as they circled lower, Daniel spotted it. A section of ground that had cracked open slightly, revealing a dark metal surface beneath the soil, far too smooth and symmetrical to be natural rock. There, he said, pointing. Land near that crack, but not too close. Lumi obeyed, setting down carefully a safe distance away. Daniel approached the crack slowly, scanner raised, and the readings spiked immediately, confirming his fear. Whatever lay buried beneath the nesting ground wasn't a fallen star at all. It was old technology, likely from another crashed ship, far older than his own, its power core damaged, and leaking radiation into the soil for who knew how many centuries. This has probably been slowly getting worse for a very long time, Daniel said quietly. The eggs, they're the most sensitive to it. That's probably why they were the first to suffer. Now it's strong enough to affect grown dragons too. Can you fix it? Lumi asked, her voice tight with worry. Daniel studied the crack, the darkness beneath it narrow, jagged, clearly leading down into some kind of buried chamber. He tried to imagine his own body fitting through a gap that size and immediately knew the answer. I can't get down there, he admitted. It's too narrow, and honestly, too dangerous for me to navigate blind. Then who can? Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, at the wings that had once been called broken and useless, wings built differently than any other dragon on this planet, small enough and light enough to fit through spaces no other flyer, human or dragon, ever could. Understanding dawned slowly across Lumi's face, and with it came fear. You want me to go down there, she said. I want you to be ready to, Daniel corrected gently, though even as he said it, he already knew there was no other choice. First, we figure out exactly what we're dealing with, and we build something that can stop it. Then, if it comes to it, yes, you might be the only one small enough to actually reach it. Above them, the sky had begun to darken, storm clouds rolling in from the west, the same kind of storm that had first brought Rask and the dying eggs to Daniel's doorstep years ago. Lumi stared down at the crack in the earth, at the darkness that held the source of a sickness now threatening everything and everyone she loved, and felt, for the first time since those early days of failed flights, the full weight of fear settle heavily in her chest. But beside her stood the one person who had never once let that kind of fear win. Okay, she said quietly, steadying her voice. Then let's figure it out. Together. 3 days of work went into building the device. 3 days where Daniel barely slept, pulling apart old ship components he had kept for years without knowing why, guessing that someday something would need them. It turned out that day had finally come. The device itself was small enough to strap across Lumi's chest, built from a containment casing he had salvaged long ago and wiring stripped from half his remaining equipment. He couldn't be entirely sure it would work. He wasn't a physicist, only a man who understood machines well enough to build something close to what old textbooks described as a radiation dampener, something that might be able to seal the leaking power core long enough to stop the poisoning, if not neutralize it completely. This has to be exact, Daniel said, checking the straps one final time as Lumi stood still outside the crack in the ridge. Around them, several elders including Rask had gathered, along with a handful of worried onlookers, though none dared approach too closely. Once you're inside, follow the readings on this small screen. Bright green light means you're getting closer. Red means back away immediately. No hero moments, understand? I understand, Lumi said, though her voice trembled slightly. Daniel hesitated, his hand resting on the side of her face the way he used to when she was small enough to fit in his arms. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. There is no other way, Lumi said quietly. You said so yourself. I'm the only one who can fit. She was right, and they both knew it, but knowing it didn't make it easier. Then listen to me, Daniel said, steadying his voice despite the fear twisting in his chest. You were never weak. Not when you hatched, not when you couldn't fly, not now. Every single person on this planet who told you that you couldn't do something was wrong, every time, and you proved it every time. This is just one more time. Lumi nodded, swallowing hard, and turned toward the crack in the earth. For the first time since Daniel had built her wing supports years ago, he could not go with her. His body was too large for the passage, and his presence, human breathing and human heartbeat, might interfere with the sensitive readings she needed to track alone. This was hers to finish. She crawled into the darkness, wings tucked tightly against her body, claws finding purchase on smooth, cold metal that clearly did not belong to this world. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing her to squeeze through gaps that scraped uncomfortably against her scales, but she kept moving, following the faint green glow on the small screen strapped to her chest. The deeper she went, the warmer the air became, thick with that same sour smell from before, now strong enough to make her eyes water. Old metal walls surrounded her, covered in strange markings unlike anything dragon or human she had ever seen, remnants of some long-dead civilization whose final resting place had been slowly poisoning the ground above for centuries. Finally, the passage opened into a small chamber, and there, embedded in the far wall, was the source, a cracked, glowing core, pulsing with unstable red light, radiating heat, and that same invisible poison that had killed eggs and sickened grown dragons. Lumi's claws trembled as she approached it. The readings on her screen flashed rapidly between green and red, warning her to be careful, to move precisely, to not make a single mistake in a space this unstable. She thought of the cliffs where she once failed to fly, over and over, each fall painful and humiliating, and how none of those failures had stopped her, because someone believed she could keep trying anyway. Carefully, she attached the device Daniel had built directly onto the surface of the cracked core, following his instructions exactly, aligning the small clamps, activating the dampening field with a press of one claw. The core's red glow flickered, sputtered, and slowly began to dim, replaced by a steady, quiet blue light instead. The sour smell in the air began to fade almost immediately, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Lumi allowed herself to breathe freely. It had worked. Relief flooded through her so strongly that her legs nearly gave out beneath her, but she forced herself to move, retracing her path back through the narrow passage, wings scraping against stone, heart pounding with something that felt less like fear now and more like triumph. When she finally emerged into daylight, blinking against the sudden brightness, a crowd had gathered outside the crack, far larger than the one that had watched her enter. Daniel was there first, rushing forward and pulling her into a tight embrace before she had even fully climbed free of the opening. "It worked," she said, her voice hoarse from the thick underground air. "The core, it's stable now." The light turned blue. Around them, a cheer rose from the gathered dragons, uncertain at first, then growing louder as words spread through the crowd. Rask stepped forward, his ancient eyes shining with something Daniel had never seen from him before, open, unguarded respect. "The weak one," Rask said slowly, "has saved us all." "She was never weak," Daniel said, standing protectively beside Lumi, his hand resting on her scaled shoulder. "She just needed the chance to prove it." Lumi looked between the elder and her father, exhaustion and pride mixing together in her chest, and for the first time in her life, she felt the full, complete truth of those words settle somewhere deep inside her. She had flown when no one believed she could. Now, she had saved them all the same way. Spring came differently that year. The nesting grounds, once poisoned by centuries of buried radiation, slowly returned to health, the soil growing warm and rich instead of sour and sick. For the first time and longer than any elder could remember, eggs across the entire valley hatched without loss, dozens of healthy hatchlings breaking free of their shells with strong wings and steady heartbeats. Daniel stood at the edge of the nesting grounds watching it happen, a sight he had once feared he would never witness, not after those first 4 eggs had gone still under his hands years ago. Beside him, Lumi watched with equal wonder, no longer the smallest, weakest creature in the valley, but something the entire clan now spoke of with quiet reverence. "They're calling me something new," Lumi said, tilting her head as a group of young hatchlings nearby stared up at her with wide, curious eyes. "What's that?" Daniel asked. "Sky Mender," she said, a small huff of amusement in her voice. "Rask says it will become part of the old stories, passed down the way stories about the fallen star used to be. Feels strange, doesn't it? Being part of a story instead of just living your life." "Very strange," Lumi agreed, then nudged him gently with her snout. "But not bad." In the months since the core had been sealed, much had changed between the dragons and the lone human who had lived quietly among them for years. Where once Daniel's strange tools and stranger ideas had been tolerated at best, now dragons young and old approached him openly, curious about human knowledge, asking questions about flight, about machines, about the wider universe he sometimes spoke of on quiet evenings. Rask, once the most doubtful of all the elders, had become an unlikely ally, spending long afternoons at Daniel's workshop learning what he could about human engineering, determined that no future generation of dragons would suffer the way Lumi's clutch once had. "We are not so different, perhaps," Rask admitted one evening, watching Daniel adjust a training harness meant for a young hatchling whose wings, much like Lumi's once had, seemed slightly uneven. "Your kind builds where nature falls short. Perhaps that is its own kind of magic." Daniel smiled at that, thinking of every night spent sketching wing designs by firelight, every failed attempt, every small victory that had led them here. Maybe magic and metal aren't as different as your old stories thought. Lumi, now fully grown into her strength, spent much of her time working directly with the newest hatchlings, especially the ones born with wings that didn't quite match the rest of their clutch. Wings too thin, too short, too uneven by old dragon standards. Where once such hatchlings would have faced quiet culling under the old ways, now they were brought straight to Lumi and Daniel's workshop instead. "You don't fly the way everyone else does," Lumi told a small silver hatchling one afternoon, watching the young dragon stumble awkwardly during a training glide, wings catching air unevenly, just as hers once had. "That doesn't mean you can't fly at all. It just means we find your way instead of theirs." The hatchling looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes that reminded Lumi painfully of her own reflection from years ago. "Everyone says I'm too weak." "They said that about me too," Lumi said, settling down beside the small dragon, her wings, strong and steady now, folding comfortably against her back. "Ask my father how many wing frames it took before I finally flew properly. He'll tell you it was more than anyone should ever need. But every single failure got me one step closer." Daniel, watching from a short distance away as he repaired another small harness meant for the growing line of hatchlings who needed a little extra help finding their wings, felt something settle warmly in his chest, something that felt very close to the word home. He thought sometimes of the ship he had crashed here in, of the life he had once expected to live among the stars, surveying planets, cataloging strange new worlds for people back on Earth who might never know what became of him. That life felt distant now, replaced by something he had never planned for, but had somehow grown to treasure more than anything. A daughter who had taught an entire species that weakness was never permanent, only temporary, waiting for the right kind of belief to change it. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains in familiar shades of orange and gold, Lumi settled beside her father near the old crashed ship, now half covered in vines and years of growth, more monument than wreckage at this point. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "Your old life, before all this?" Daniel considered the question honestly before answering. "Sometimes, but not enough to trade this for it." He glanced at her, at the daughter who had once been told she would never survive her first season, let alone grow into the dragon who had saved an entire species. "I got something better instead." Lumi leaned against him, the same trusting gesture she had made since she was small enough to fit in his arms, though now her weight nearly knocked him sideways. Above them, several young dragons practiced flying in slow, careful circles, some strong and steady, others still learning their own uneven rhythm. Each one watched patiently by a father and daughter who understood better than anyone that weakness was never the end of a story. It was only ever the beginning.